Hello, welcome to this presentation entitled Moral Objectivism based upon your author's book, Ethics, by Mr. Louis Poyman. Let's talk a little bit about what moral objectivism is and contrast it somewhat with relativism, a concept that you're probably already familiar with because of a previous presentation. Objectivism is sort of at the other end of the spectrum and holds that moral principles have objective validity. This is something like saying Newton's laws, one of which is a force equals mass times acceleration, has been traditionally regarded as having quote-unquote objective validity, or Kepler's laws of planetary motion, the three laws, somewhat similar. Universal law of gravity, objective validity. Perhaps now it would be, oddly enough, the objective validity of the theory of relativity. That's not actually a conundrum or an inconsistency. The objective theory of relativity has been made objective because of the fact that people have been able to verify it scientifically. So in this particular situation, moral theorists argue that moral principles are objective rather like laws of physics are. And consequently, it's independent of cultural acceptance. In other words, that would contrast with what we discussed previously called cultural relativism. Moral principles are universal, but they're not necessarily without exception, which would mean, in other words, there might be instances in which, while you're acknowledging that a certain moral principle, such as, for example, the time-honored, almost universal seeming principle, thou shalt not kill, or murder is wrong, generally speaking, there may be no perceptible or conceivable exception to something like do not kill, but under certain circumstances in which you or me or your family are perhaps being threatened with our lives, then it may be that if it's possible to go ahead and quote-unquote take somebody out before they take you out, then that might be the exception to the normal universal imprimatur, don't kill. Moral objectivism, again, is a view that there are universal principles valid for all people and all situations and times. So I invite you to think of what such a principle might be beyond simply it's wrong to kill or wrong to murder, depending upon how it is you express and define those terms. Wrong to lie, wrong to cheat, wrong to commit adultery, things of this nature. Some of the things I just mentioned are considered to be often taboos, or at least related to taboos, and there appear to be something like universal taboos, but you may not necessarily find that all people in all situations at all times have always honored those principles. However, 98%, let us say, of the time, if that's the case, it appears that there are something like objective principles that are at least tacitly acknowledged in the background of moral philosophies. Let's make a case and just go along with the program offered by the author for moral objectivism. One appears to be the appeal to divine law and human sin. What that essentially means is that something like God, in some religious tradition, a divine being or force, commanded obedience or commanded certain kinds of behavior, and that would, on this view, constitute a kind of an objective declaration by a god or godlike being. And of course the other situation is, and not everybody believes this, but I'm going to go ahead and use it as an example, that there's something involved in the fact of human sin. To call it a fact is to make it objective. Now, clearly, that particular issue in and of itself certainly demands more controversy and is a subject that we're not going to delve into too deeply in this course. I invite you to do further research on the concept of sin and certainly divine law. But I simply pointed out here because of the fact that typically when philosophers and theologians have early on theorized, they have used an appeal to divine law and also a notion, some sort of a notion of the objective fact of human sin. Another explanation, which is similar but not necessarily identical to the previous concept, is natural law. And this holds that morality is a function of human nature, and that the moral principles can be found in looking at humanity itself and society, or what it means to be a human being. Kind of metaphysical, because natural law depends upon some kind of a concept, a metaphysical concept, I would argue, and probably some science mixed in with it, of what a human being is. There are certainly today a good many theorists who believe that there is such a thing as natural law built into what it means to be a human being, but I want to point out that that is not the same thing as saying that it came from God or some notion or conception of God. In other words, it's possible to be a natural law moral philosophizer and not necessarily believe that the origins of objective ethical principles come from God. The argument is they come directly from human nature. Now, you might find that a little bit controversial in and of itself and perhaps far-fetched and hard to believe, but now there seems to be a growing movement amongst anthropologists and other thinkers that, in contrast with what we call postmodernism, for example, that indicates that to them that perhaps something in human nature is inherent, innate, an inherent basic moral sense. That notion can be associated with natural law. And the suggestion, of course, here is that these things are internal, intrinsic to what it means to be a human being, that you could not define a human being without reference to something like a natural law. The kinds of principles, by the way, that emerge from natural law or divine command may look very similar. In other words, if you have the divine command, thou shalt not kill, for example, as an illustration, then it is possible that natural law could say roughly the same thing, but it wouldn't be expressed by a deity. That's the difference. Along the lines of objectivism is something we call moral absolutism. And this is a notion that there's only one morally correct answer to every moral problem. Moral absolutism tends to take objectivism to the extreme, and suggests that there are moral principles a person ought never to violate. And of course, some interpretations of biblical type scriptures and passages seem to press upon this particular interpretation, if you will, of the origins of moral precepts. There is no exception to what is identified as moral norm. So if you're an absolutist, you're not going to admit of the possibility that there could be any condition under which a specific precept, such as, for example, thou shalt not kill, could be violated. No instance in which you could ever ignore it. Again, that's absolutism. So an objectivist isn't necessarily an absolutist. I want to make a fine distinction between the two. An objectivist believes or can believe that a principle such as thou shalt not kill is objectively true, even despite the fact that there might be some instances in which that principle would be overturned. A moral absolutist essentially says, no, you can never, ever overturn a principle once it's construed to be an objective, absolute principle. Let's take a look at the concept of natural law, because it has been around for a long period of time, and it first started, generally, we say, amongst the Stoics. It probably preceded the Stoics with people such as Plato, depending upon your reading, and some of the pre-Socratics, and certainly people like Socrates, although he does not necessarily expressly use the term, may be read as, believing in some such concept as natural law as the Stoics did. And of course the Stoics, relying upon people like Socrates, to some extent Plato, their predecessors at the time in which the Stoics flourished, probably derived most of their notion of natural law from a specific kind of reading of a person like Socrates as characterized by Plato. Stoics believed that humans had a divine spark, otherwise called in Greek the logos spermatikos. That is essentially an account or a kind of statement, a divine statement, so to speak. The seed of a divine statement, spermatikos, literally means seed, really, but spark is good. So it is a part of our human nature that we have this divine spark. So they sort of blended, if you will, a kind of two themes. One of which is that there is God. The other of which is there is a divine spark in us that is God-like, you could say. The universe is, according to the Stoic view, governed by rational laws, and all creation obeys those. Again, getting back to what I was mentioning previously, not unlike Newton's laws or Kepler's laws, or a well-tested scientific theory about how the universe functions, physically, let's say, morality, particularly in a natural law interpretation, is construed to be somewhat similar. But, at the same time, we human beings do have the power of choice. So we can choose to be governed by logos spermatikos, the divine spark within us, or we can ignore it. And I'm sure that that doesn't sound too unfamiliar to you. It's just that perhaps some of the language and terminology that people are likely used to express moral concerns and to make moral judgments is a little bit different than what you see here before you. One really famous natural law theologian was St. Thomas Aquinas, seen pictured here in an artist's conception of the young saint. And he, of course, combined cosmic law, which is ordinarily construed to be objective as opposed to subjective, with Aristotle's concept that humans, like every natural object, have a specific purpose and function. So if you read a little bit of Aristotle, you'll realize that Aristotle's rather organic philosophy suggests that for a human to function properly, that human being has to realize what the proper objective, telos, end, if you will, of a human being is, and try to perfect that end. So humans, they have a certain purpose and function. It turns out, of course, for good old Aristotle, that the proper purpose and function of a human being is primarily to end up being a contemplator of eternal truth. Somebody who actually exercises his or her reason maximally, because it is human beings, after all, that are rational compared to other creatures. Now that certainly could be a challenging or challenged statement. Maybe there are other creatures that are rational, but certainly at the time in which Aquinas wrote, and under the influence of somebody like Aristotle, that term Homo sapiens that we utilize, now we call it Homo sapiens sapientia, the human being, is a reflection of this idea that human beings are rational beings. And that's indeed the way Aristotle defined humans, and St. Thomas Aquinas took that notion and added to it a bit of theology. Thomas believed that the reasoning process has a purpose to discover these natural laws, as did Aristotle. So it is possible to discover natural law, or, if you will, inherent universal moral principles through reasoning. Not principally through, if you will, faith, but through reasoning, through the use and calculated use of human prowess. Perhaps these days we'd say you can use critical thinking to try to glean from the universe and from your own particular introspective experience what it means to be a moral person under the rubric or umbrella of natural law. Now we want to talk a little bit about the doctrine of double effect. The idea is with double effect that, in a way, quote-unquote, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. To some extent, for every action that you engage in, there will always be an unintended outcome. So there's going to be a little good, a little bit of bad. Part of the idea, of course, here is to produce better results than worse ones. And the conditions for an act to be permissible under this doctrine have to do with these following criteria. The nature of the act. What kind of act is it? What is a person doing? There's some acts, of course, that would not fit well into this, like the act of murder. The so-called means-end condition. What kind of means is being applied in order to gain the end in sight, and is there a kind of proportion between the two? I mean, it is possible, certainly, and probably does happen, that very nasty things are done by people, by policies, by governments, and yet, in a long run, it perhaps could be argued that good results, a tremendous amount of good. Under this doctrine, there has to be some kind of appropriate amelioration, so to speak, between the means and the end. The means has got to be adjusted accordingly and cannot in and of itself be out of bounds with respect to something that be regarded as appropriate moral comportment, however arguable it is and subject to interpretation. The right intention condition, of course, means that you have to add that to the first two. If you're an agent, a moral agent, then you have to have the intention to do the right thing. And of course, proportionality has to involve all of these other things. What kind of an act is being conducted with respect to the means utilized to achieve an end and the intention? All of these things have to fit proportionally into a kind of an equation, so to speak. So, at the very least, while ideally in real life we might not be able to meet any of these criterion completely once they're spelled out, we will use them to aim at. We will use them in order to, quote-unquote, hit the mark and not miss the mark when we actually set about to deliberate and also to behave appropriately according to this doctrine. Now, there are 10 principles that are often regarded to be necessary for what is called the good life, and we're going to discuss the good life from a couple of different points of view as a more technical kind of end state to strive for within what we would call a flourishing human community. That is to say, a human community where everybody is functioning to some extent in such a fashion as to bring about their own best well-being and end state, and thus contribute to the well-being of the entire community as a whole. Normally, these kinds of principles are not regarded as arbitrary, meaning that they are not simply invented, let us say, for the sake of expedience by some human or some committee or government, and often regarded as constituting the elements of what we would like to think of as a successful society that promotes social cohesion as well as personal well-being. There's a kind of a dual aspect here. The individual flourishes and is gains by this arrangement, and so does the society at large. So what are those principles? Some of these are embodied in, I suppose, the Code of Hammurabi, and certainly in the Torah, the Decalogue, 10 Commandments. One of them is don't kill innocent people. Now, another term we have for this, by the way, is murder, but certainly, our legal system has many definitions of killing, or types of killing, depending upon intent and circumstance, like manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, etc. But don't kill, don't cause unnecessary suffering, don't lie or deceive. Many of these things you've been exposed to, perhaps in a different language. Don't steal or cheat. Keep your promises, honor your contracts. Notice this seems to be kind of a modern version of sometimes what we call the commandments. Don't deprive another person of his or her freedom. That is to say, do not enslave them, do not constrain them against their will, do not keep them captive, do justice, treating people as they deserve to be treated, reciprocate, show gratitude for services rendered, help other people. I think that, in truth, help other people, especially when the cost to oneself is minimal. So what this sort of means that there should be a proportion involved, and it does certainly promote the idea on this interpretation that you are of value yourself, and it wouldn't necessarily, this principle wouldn't necessarily require you to do a complete and utter self-sacrifice, but we will call those kinds of events that take place that are self-sacrificial supererogatory events in the near future, such as engaging in heroic acts. But generally speaking, help other people as long as it doesn't completely ruin you or your family, and obey laws that are just. Meaning, of course, if you can argue legitimately and demonstrate that a law is unjust, then on this view, you don't necessarily have to obey it. Many, many, many great people, from Thoreau to Gandhi, of course, to many religious leaders that could be mentioned, to great social innovators such as Martin Luther King, many others have abided by these principles for the most part, and certainly decided that they would not obey just laws. Very quick example, Henry David Thoreau, American transcendentalist back in the 19th century, chose to go to jail rather than to pay his tax money because he felt it was unjust to pay the government that kind of money in order that the government pursue the ends which he thought were inappropriate for them to pursue. So that's a case in point. There are many, many others that you can think about too. What we call the principle of humanity. This thought is, again, simply offering it to you to think about, to read about, to get an opportunity to discuss with other people in our course. While there may be many differences between human beings and cultures, this idea says that there is a basic nature. There are indeed many anthropologists and many scientists who believe that, and there are also many people who don't, mind you. So that's why the idea of human beings having a basic nature might be a little controversial. We are all vulnerable to disease, despair, to death. You might say that these are almost the passing sights of Buddha mentioned here. You're likely to get a disease. Hopefully it doesn't become life-threatening, at least not too often in your life. Despair, that one of those things that happens when loved ones die. You lose property, you lose a job. Death, of course, unfortunately, or not, that is inevitable. And the idea is that these and other characteristics do kind of unite us, and these and other considerations probably induce us to consider how we might live together for the betterment of ourselves individually, and how we might be able to help other people in a community at large. And of course, even if you argue that there are some fundamental differences, or more fundamental differences, between humans of one culture than another, the idea here would be that there's still more in common than we have different, all of us. So I leave it to you. Some of this may seem common sense. Some of it also may, for some of you listening, may appear to be too arguable. But the nature of philosophy, of course, is to discuss these things, clarify them, and there's no intent on my part here to compel you to agree with any of this. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping that the presentation here will be construed to be in the light in which I'm attempting to offer it, and that is objectively, with some clarification. But most of the clarification is going to come from you as you introspect on these matters, and also get an opportunity to discuss these issues and topics and concepts with others in discussion threads and forums. Lastly, we can talk a little bit about ethical situationalism. And what ethical situationalists generally believe is that there are such things as objective moral principles, but they might be applied differently in different contexts. And what that in essence is saying that while you might believe, for example, in not killing, it may be that there's a certain context in which it is discovered by the moral agent that perhaps the only thing that could be done under those circumstances is to kill. This often happens in wartime conflict. It often happens in self-defense contexts. It may happen when a person is attempting simply to survive. Stealing, another case in point. Perhaps not as serious a matter as killing someone or something. But, the ethical situationalist would say something like, it is wrong to steal. However, if it is the only means by which you can help your family survive, then under those circumstances, in that context, you either A, can violate the principle, or B, recognize that in a specific context, that different kind of behavior might be called upon, or a somewhat mutated version or morphed version of the original principle is to be applied. And of course, this is very different from ethical relativism, although functionally it might look the same, which denies that there are universal ethical principles. Ethical situationalism does not deny that. Now, I'd like you to think about some of the things we've talked about so far in our first opening chapters of our book, and also in the presentations I'm giving you. And at least for now, see if you can apply some of this thinking, some of these concepts, to various video segments that I'm going to try to guide you to.